In the still morning air, what began as a routine flight would soon turn into one of Canada's most haunting aviation tragedies. I'm Jhon, and this is Plane Crashed, where we uncover the true stories behind history's most unforgettable air disasters. Today, we revisit the chilling final moments of Air Canada Flight 621, a journey that started in calm skies but ended in unimaginable horror. What unfolded in the minutes between takeoff and touchdown would expose a deadly chain of human decisions, mechanical design flaws, and a single catastrophic mistake that forever changed the way safety is understood in the skies. It began as a bright and promising July morning in 1970 when Air Canada Flight 621 prepared for its short journey from Montreal to Toronto, a flight that should have lasted less than an hour. A simple hop between two of Canada's busiest cities. On board was a McDonnell Douglas DC-8, a sleek, powerful aircraft that represented the cutting edge of commercial aviation at the time, capable of flying high, fast, and reliably. The crew, led by Captain Peter Hamilton and First Officer Donald Rowe, were both experienced men, professionals who had logged countless hours in the cockpit. There was nothing to suggest that this flight would be any different from the dozens they had completed before. The passengers, 100 in total, along with 9 crew members, took their seats, fastened their belts, and prepared for a smooth and uneventful flight. But beneath that calm exterior, inside the cockpit, lay the seeds of a catastrophic misunderstanding that no one on board could possibly have foreseen. The issue centered on a piece of equipment that most passengers would never notice: the aircraft's spoiler system. Spoilers are panels on the wings that can be raised to disrupt airflow, helping the plane to slow down during landing. On the DC-8, these spoilers could be armed before touchdown, so they would automatically deploy once the wheels made contact with the runway. It was a simple concept, but the system's design and its operation were not as foolproof as they seemed. In the months leading up to this flight, the DC-8 fleet had experienced several close calls related to spoiler deployment. Some crews had mistakenly armed the spoilers too early, causing them to deploy in flight, a potentially deadly mistake that could destroy lift and send an aircraft plummeting toward the ground. Because of these past incidents, pilots across the airline had grown wary of the system, developing an unspoken fear that it could betray them at the worst possible moment. As a result, many crews began to adopt their own methods for handling it, deviating slightly from standard procedures in an attempt to avoid what they saw as a lurking danger. Flight 621's captain and first officer were no exception. Captain Hamilton had a firm belief that the spoiler system was flawed, that it could not be trusted to function safely if armed before landing. He had spoken about this to colleagues before, expressing his concerns that arming it in advance might lead to disaster. His first officer, Donald Rowe, however, preferred to follow official procedure, which stated that the spoiler should be armed during the final approach. It was a difference of opinion that had been discussed on previous flights, but on this one, that subtle disagreement would have devastating consequences. As the plane climbed out of Montreal, passengers likely gazed out the windows at the bright summer landscape below, unaware of the quiet debate unfolding up front. The flight was smooth, routine, and ordinary in every way that matters. But in the cockpit, the two pilots were already thinking ahead to their arrival in Toronto. As the flight leveled off, they reviewed their landing checklist, and once again the topic of the spoilers surfaced. Captain Hamilton reiterated his concerns, insisting that arming them too soon was unsafe. He preferred to wait until after touchdown before engaging them, reasoning that it would prevent any chance of premature deployment. First Officer Rowe, though respectful of his captain's experience, believed that doing so violated the proper procedure and risked other complications. Their conversation was calm, professional, but the difference in approach was clear. It wasn't an argument, It was a misunderstanding waiting to bloom into tragedy. By the time Flight 621 began its descent toward Toronto, the weather was perfect. Visibility was clear, the winds light, and the runway dry. Air traffic control guided them in as usual, and everything seemed normal. The passengers would have felt the familiar sensation of the aircraft lowering its nose, engines quietly throttling back as the landscape below drew closer. To them, it was just another landing. But in the cockpit, the pilots were preparing to execute a maneuver shaped by that lingering uncertainty about the spoilers. As they descended, Captain Hamilton reminded his co-pilot not to arm the spoilers yet. His intention was to do it manually the moment they touched down, a split-second action that, in theory, would keep them safe from the feared premature deployment. It was a plan he had used before, one that had never caused trouble. Yet the DC-8 systems were unforgiving, and the margin for error was almost invisible. First Officer Rowe, following the captain's instructions, left the spoiler lever disarmed during the approach. The airplane continued to descend, engines humming softly as the runway loomed ahead. Inside the cabin, the passengers likely felt the gentle bumps of turbulence, the faint whine of engines adjusting for final approach. There was no sign of danger. At about 300 feet above the ground, Captain Hamilton decided it was time. Believing they were close enough to touch down, he instructed Rowe to deploy the spoilers manually, a fatal misjudgment. The aircraft was still in the air, not yet on the runway. The instant the lever was pulled, the spoilers on the wings extended, instantly destroying the smooth flow of air over the wings. The DC-8, suddenly stripped of lift, dropped like a stone. In that horrifying moment, both pilots realized what had happened. Hamilton shouted for Rowe to retract the spoilers immediately, but the damage was done. The massive jets slammed onto the runway with tremendous force, the impact so violent that the landing gear collapsed and part of the right wing broke open. But miraculously, the crew managed to lift the plane back into the air. With raw instinct, Hamilton pushed the throttles forward, trying to climb away from the ground and circle back for another attempt. The engines roared, straining to keep the crippled plane airborne. In the cabin, passengers screamed as the aircraft shuddered, pieces of debris breaking off behind them. The first impact had already set in motion a chain of failures that could not be undone. Hydraulic lines were ruptured, fuel was leaking, and a fire was beginning to spread through the wing. The DC-8 was mortally wounded, but still flying. From the cockpit, the pilots struggled to regain control, their minds racing to make sense of what had gone wrong. They had no idea that the spoilers had caused the entire catastrophe. All they knew was that something terrible had happened on touchdown, and now they were fighting to save the plane. They radioed the tower, declaring an emergency, and began preparing for another landing attempt. But the situation was worse than they knew. The right wing was burning, and the internal structure of the aircraft had been fatally compromised. The DC-8 climbed briefly before beginning to lose altitude again. The sound of alarms filled the cockpit as warning lights flashed across the panel. In the cabin, passengers could see smoke trailing from the wing, the smell of fuel seeping into the air. For the next few minutes, they would experience the unimaginable, the terrifying silence that comes when hope begins to fade. The pilots were still calm, still trying to save their aircraft, but there was little they could do. The fire intensified, the right engine failed, and then the second. Control was slipping away. When the airplane finally descended for the last time, it was no longer a question of if, but when. Moments later, the burning DC-8 crashed into a field near Brampton, Ontario, exploding on impact. All 109 people on board were killed instantly. The investigation that followed would reveal the horrifying truth. The entire disaster had been triggered by the premature deployment of the spoilers, an action rooted not in carelessness, but in a misunderstanding born of fear. The pilots were not reckless. They were experienced men trying to avoid what they believed was a greater danger. But that decision, made in the interest of safety, turned out to be the very thing that doomed them. Investigators discovered that the spoiler system itself had not failed. It had functioned exactly as designed. The real failure lay in communication, in the lack of clarity in procedures, and in the human instinct to improvise when something feels uncertain. Air Canada, and indeed the aviation world, would learn a painful lesson from Flight 621, the tragedy. Prompted major changes to flight training and operating procedures, ensuring that every pilot understood not just the rules, but the reasons behind them. It was a harsh reminder that in aviation, even a single misjudged moment can erase every safeguard. The morning that began with promise ended in fire and loss, a cruel testament to how fragile perfection can be. And for those who later walked the quiet field where Flight 621 fell, the sight of twisted metal and scorched earth told a story that words could never fully capture, a story of human error, mechanical precision, and the haunting reality that even the smallest misunderstanding can alter the course of hundreds of lives forever. As Air Canada Flight 621 descended toward Toronto, the tension in the cockpit was invisible to everyone else on board, hidden behind calm voices and steady hands. The aircraft, a DC-8, glided smoothly through the summer sky, its 4 engines humming with quiet confidence, its passengers unaware that the most critical moments of their lives were now unfolding in real time. The flight had been perfect, so far routine, uneventful and peaceful, and yet, inside the cockpit, the two pilots were about to make a series of decisions that would turn this calm descent into one of the most horrifying accidents in Canadian aviation history. As the plane crossed below 3,000 feet, the city of Toronto stretched out beneath them, sunlight reflecting off rooftops and highways like shards of glass. The air traffic controllers cleared them for landing on runway 32, a familiar approach for the experienced crew. The captain and first officer ran through their final checklist: landing gear down, flaps extended, speed stabilized, and everything appearing normal. The captain's voice was calm, confident. He'd done this hundreds of times before. But beneath that calm exterior, the memory of earlier DC-8 accidents and warnings about the spoiler system weighed heavily on his mind. Those mechanical spoilers, small metal panels, designed to pop up from the wings and disrupt airflow, were supposed to be armed before touchdown, automatically deploying the instant the plane's wheels hit the runway. But the captain didn't trust the system. He had read too many reports of spoilers deploying in midair, leading to catastrophic crashes. He believed that arming them ahead of time was gambling with lives. So he made a decision, a fateful one. They would not arm the spoilers during approach. Instead, he would deploy them manually after the aircraft had touched down. It was a decision that would seem harmless in theory, but in practice would become deadly. As the plane descended through the final 1,000 feet, the captain instructed his first officer, "Don't arm them yet. I'll handle it on the ground." The first officer hesitated briefly. He knew this wasn't by the book, but he followed his captain's lead. They were seconds from the runway now, the landscape below rushing up toward them, the passengers feeling the gentle thump of landing gear locking into place. To the 109 people aboard, there was no reason to feel fear. Children pressed their faces against the windows. Businessmen reviewed their notes for upcoming meetings, and families held hands, ready to step into a bright summer day. The captain's hands were steady on the controls, his eyes fixed on the runway ahead. At around 300 feet above the ground, he believed the time had come. The runway looked close, the descent rate was steady, and instinct told him it was safe. "Spoilers," he said. The first officer obeyed, reaching for the lever, and in that split second, the unimaginable happened. The spoilers deployed instantly. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The smooth flow of air over the wings was destroyed. Lift vanished. and the 150,000-pound aircraft dropped out of the sky like a rock. The captain's heart must have seized in terror as he realized what had happened. He shouted for the spoilers to be retracted, but the damage was done. The aircraft slammed onto the runway far harder than any landing could sustain. The impact was so violent that it tore through the landing gear, crushed part of the wing structure, and sent shockwaves through the fuselage. A blinding spray of fuel erupted from ruptured tanks, igniting instantly into a flash of fire along the right wing. Passengers screamed as the cabin filled with the sound of tearing metal, shattering glass, and roaring engines. The DC-8 bounced back into the air, crippled but momentarily airborne again, its pilots fighting desperately to regain control. "Go around! Go around!" the captain shouted, pushing the throttles forward. The engines surged, roaring with effort as the plane clawed for altitude. They were flying again, but only barely. Inside, chaos reigned. The cabin shook violently, overhead compartments burst open, and debris filled the aisles. Outside, fire licked the right wing, growing stronger as leaking fuel fed the flames. Smoke began to trail behind the aircraft, visible for miles. The flight crew was working frantically. The first officer radioed the tower. "Air Canada 621, we've had an explosion on landing. We're going around." Their voices were controlled but urgent. They didn't know the full extent of the damage. They only knew something terrible had happened. In reality, the plane was fatally wounded. The impact had cracked open the right wing's fuel tanks, and now fire was spreading rapidly. Hydraulic systems were failing, and critical controls were becoming sluggish. Yet for the moment, the DC-8 was still airborne, struggling upward, climbing to about 3,000 feet as the crew tried to stabilize it for an emergency landing attempt. The passengers sat in stunned silence, many praying, some crying quietly, others gripping the seats before them. Smoke began to seep into the cabin, the smell of burning jet fuel thick and suffocating. Through the windows, passengers could see the right wing burning, flames trailing behind them in the wind. In the cockpit, the situation deteriorated by the second. Warning lights flashed red across the instrument panel. Engine fire, hydraulic pressure low, electrical systems failing. The captain tried to shut down the burning engine, but the fire had already spread beyond control. They turned the aircraft in a wide arc, attempting to return to the airport, but their odds of making it were shrinking with every moment. The tower cleared them for an emergency landing, but it was too late. The fire began to eat away at the wing's internal structure, melting cables, weakening the spars that held the engines in place. Then came the final blow. An explosion tore through the right wing as the remaining fuel ignited. The sound was deafening, the jolt so powerful that the entire aircraft lurched violently. Flames engulfed the right side of the fuselage, and the DC-8 began to break apart midair. The pilots fought to keep control, but the plane was disintegrating around them. The nose pitched downward, the right wing collapsed, and the once majestic jetliner plunged toward the fields below. It was a descent that lasted only seconds, but must have felt like an eternity. Witnesses on the ground later described seeing a ball of fire streaking across the sky, pieces of metal raining down as the aircraft came apart. Then came the final impact, a blinding explosion that tore through the fields near Brampton, a thunderous roar that could be heard miles away. The DC-8 hit the ground nose first at tremendous speed, erupting into a fireball that consumed everything in its path. There were no survivors. The force of the crash left a crater, so deep that investigators later found fragments of the fuselage buried several meters underground. In the aftermath, the field burned for hours, black smoke billowing into the sky. Fire crews rushed to the scene, but there was nothing to save. The wreckage was unrecognizable, a tangled mass of twisted metal, charred earth, and fragments of belongings scattered across the countryside. It was one of the most devastating air disasters Canada had ever seen. When investigators arrived, they faced a grim task. The destruction was so complete that even determining the sequence of events required painstaking reconstruction. But slowly, through the wreckage and the cockpit voice recorder, the story emerged. The cause was not a mechanical failure, not sabotage, not weather, but human misunderstanding. The spoilers had been deployed prematurely, robbing the aircraft of lift just before touchdown. The pilots, trying to prevent what they thought was a design flaw, had inadvertently triggered the very catastrophe they feared. It was a cruel irony, one that haunted investigators and fellow pilots alike. What made the tragedy even more heartbreaking was how easily it could have been avoided. The DC-8 spoiler system worked exactly as designed. Had it been armed correctly before landing, it would have deployed automatically and safely on touchdown, as intended. But fear and miscommunication had rewritten procedure in the cockpit. The captain's experience, his desire to protect his passengers, had instead doomed them. The inquiry that followed tore through every detailed training manuals, checklists, cockpit communication, and what they found was a system that allowed ambiguity to thrive. Pilots were not being consistently trained in the logic behind certain procedures. Instead, they were left to rely on habit and intuition. Air Canada quickly changed its procedures, making it mandatory for spoilers to be armed before every landing, with no deviation allowed. But those changes came too late for the 109 lives lost that morning. In the years that followed, Flight 621 became a case study in human factors, the psychology of decision-making under pressure. Aviation experts began to understand that accidents like this were rarely the result of a single error, but of a chain of events linked by misunderstanding, assumption, and misplaced confidence. Every aviation school now teaches this lesson, that trust in systems, clear communication, and adherence to procedure are the final lines of defense against disaster. Yet even decades later, the story of Flight 621 still sends chills down the spine. The field where the plane fell remains quiet now, marked by a small memorial that few outside of the aviation world know exists. Beneath that ground rest the memories of an ordinary flight turned extraordinary by one moment of confusion, 1 second of hesitation, one flick of a lever too soon. It's a chilling reminder that even in an era of advanced technology, human beings are at the heart of every flight, and that our instincts, as well-intentioned as they may be, can sometimes lead us straight into tragedy. The final moments of Flight 621 stand as both a warning and a tribute. A warning of how fragile safety truly is when fear guides decision-making, and a tribute to those who paid the ultimate price for lessons that would make the skies safer for generations to come. In the end, the story of Air Canada Flight 621 is not just about a plane crash, it's about the fragile balance between trust, procedure, and human judgment. It reminds us that even the smallest hesitation, born from fear or doubt, can ripple outward into catastrophe. Every switch, every checklist, every decision in aviation carries the weight of countless lives, and when that balance is broken, the results are devastating. The legacy of Flight 621 lives on not only in the wreckage buried beneath a quiet field, but in every cockpit procedure refined because of it. A haunting testament that behind every safety regulation written in ink, there was once a lesson written in blood.